Hello, biblical history students, New Testament history students now. I'm going to make a video for you right now. Obviously, during the week off, I didn't have time to make any videos, so what I want to try to do today, if I remember correctly, I think my last video, I went over 1 and 2 and gave you a preview of 3 and 4, and now it's going to be 4 and 5. 5 and 6. What are some things, though, I want to touch upon a couple more things from chapter 3 and 4 first, because we're dealing with history. It's important to realize, going back to, this is chapter 3, I'm kind of looking at number 4. It's important to realize the importance of Caesar's census that happened in 6 AD. Okay, how that charted the course for a lot of stuff in the first century. Now again, Luke takes the census and puts it at the time of Jesus' birth, but I explained why I think that's more of a literary convention, because Jesus was probably born around 4 to 6 BC, and so by 6 AD he would have been 12. But in any case, the importance of the census is when there was the worldwide census of Caesar in 6 AD really sparked the real beginnings of the Zealot movement in Judea. That is when Judas the Galilean led his group of zealots to fight against this census, because a census by a foreign ruler was humiliating to the Jews. Only God was their king, therefore they should not be, counted like cattle by foreign kings. And so Judas the Galilean started this zealot movement that was really a revolt against this idea of a census. And even though he was eventually killed, his family members, his son, his grandsons, and their following continued through the first century. And it has a huge impact on what eventually happens in the Jewish War of 66 to 70. Okay? Huge impact. And it also impacts a lot of the stuff that you read in the Gospels as well, as we'll see briefly. But that's the thing that you want to remember, the importance of that zealot movement. Let me see here. There's questions about whether John the Baptist was an Essene from the Qumran community. You did that. I wrote on a lot of your assignments. I think he might have had contact with them, but I don't know if he really was one of them. But there are a lot of similarities that are kind of interesting. Another interesting thing about John the Baptist is when you read in the Gospels what his message was, particularly I think in Matthew and Luke more than any, he prophesied that the Messiah was about to come, and he couches us all in Exodus language. And what he envisions is a Messiah to come and to really kick some butt within the Jewish community, to kind of thresh out the grain from the chaff, the wheat from the chaff, and to really whip them in shape so that the coming day of the Lord could come. So when you read his prophecies, he really expects some fire and brimstone, which is interesting because then when Jesus comes on the scene, much of his early ministry is anything but fire and brimstone. Instead of kicking butt, he's healing the lame and healing blind people. And at one point in the Gospels, John sends some of his followers to Jesus and say, are you the one we should be looking for, really? Because they're not doing what we said. And then Jesus basically points to what he's doing, gives scriptural backing for it. Later on in Jesus' ministry, as you'll see, he brings the hammer down. But he's giving people a time to repent before the hammer comes down. But anyway, anything left in chapter 4? It's also chapter 4. The first thing about Pilate. It's really important to know a little bit more about Pilate. As you can tell, he was kind of a nasty guy, a brutal governor who just liked to give the finger to the Jews whenever he could. He just liked to torment them, not literally torment like torture, but just to tick them off whenever he could. Which is kind of interesting Because then when you see what happens at the trial of Jesus, you kind of see that what the Sanhedrin is able to do, because they don't like him either, they want to get Jesus killed. Pilate's reaction, as soon as he finds that out, he's going to say, I don't want to get him killed. But the Jews, the Sanhedrin, this Jewish religious authorities, they find a way to stick it to him to get him to do what they want. But we'll get that in a second. But it's important to know a little bit about Pilate. The background, general background stuff you read about, it's pretty easy to understand. The talk about Jesus being the Son of Man. This is number 7 in chapter 4. I gave everybody a quick explanation of how that ties in with Daniel 7, but that's really important when you read the Gospels. When Jesus is calling himself the Son of Man, he's saying, I'm that figure. And in that chapter of chapter 7, the Son of Man ascends to the right hand of God the Almighty, and then he has the authority of God in which he will punish God's enemies. So when Jesus says, that's me, that has huge implications for what we read in the Gospel. And I'll jump ahead to his trial before the Sanhedrin. When he's taken before the Sanhedrin, actually this is kind of apropos because we're in Passion Week here. When he's taken before the Sanhedrin after he's arrested, and they throw charges at him that don't seem to stick about the temple and whatnot, when the high priest comes right out and says, are you the Christ? Are you the Messiah? Jesus says, yes, I am. And you, he's talking to the chief priest, you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. He's quoting Daniel 7, which is really important because in Daniel 7, the Son of Man who comes on the clouds of heaven, he does that so he can defeat the little horn who's tormenting God's people. And so when Jesus says that to the high priest, he's basically saying, not only, yes, I'm the Messiah, I'm the Son of Man, and you're the beast. You're the little horn, and I'm going to come for you eventually. That is what gets him killed, basically. That's why it's blasphemy. Not only does he claim to be equal with God, but he's basically saying the Jewish Sanhedrin is God's enemy. And so that's the significance of what he says there. That's why you need to know your Old Testament to fully appreciate much of the New Testament. Let's see what else we want to talk about. Let's now go on to chapter 5 and 6. I don't want to make this too long. Now we're getting into the trials and tribulations of Jesus, apropos, given the week that we're in. Again, it's important to kind of get clear that timeline that is kind of laid out in chapter number 1. All of Jesus' ministry that you read about in the Gospels really happened probably between 28 and 30. That's it. John the Baptist's ministry would have been about 27, 28. So all within a 4 or 5 year span, all that would have happened. And so if he was crucified in Passover AD 30, according to the calendar, scholars know it was either 33 AD or 30. Most think it's 30. So April 7th would be the day when he was crucified. All right. The important thing about the triumphal entry, let me say a couple things about this. I'll make it really simple. Historically speaking, the Jews were looking forward to a Messiah to become king, like a literal political king, and to defeat their pagan overlords, Rome, and then to establish the kingdom of Israel again. That's what their hope. They were looking forward to a political Messiah. And therefore, when Jesus comes on Passover, and what does Passover celebrate? The freeing from bondage of Egypt. When Jesus comes to Jerusalem for Passover, riding the donkey, it's a symbolic gesture of taken from Zechariah 9:9 about the coming Messiah. Everybody is expecting this is going to be it. Even when they sing Psalm 118, 25, 26, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna means save us. They're clearly assuming he's the Messiah who's going to do all this stuff. And the Jews expected the Messiah to come and fight against Rome and then cleanse the temple. Okay? That's really important. So what Jesus does when he comes in, everything is set up like that's going to happen. But he does the exact opposite. When you read it in Mark, it's actually more stark. He rides in, they're shouting all this stuff. He comes into the temple, and then he looks around and he goes home. Matthew has him do the temple action that day, but the point is, what Jesus ends up doing historically is he doesn't come into Jerusalem to fight Rome. In fact, when he gets into Jerusalem and he's asked about should we pay taxes to Rome, he says, well, if it's their money, sure. That doesn't sound too Messiah-like if you're a Jew. But not only that, not only does he not pick a fight with Rome, what he ends up doing, and you read this in the chapters of the Passion Week, in all three Gospels, but especially Mark and Matthew, and Luke actually, he goes into the temple. He doesn't cleanse the temple. When he drives out things and all that stuff, he is condemning the temple. That's why he quotes Jeremiah, and Jeremiah was known for being the prophet who prophesied against the temple. And this is what Jesus is doing. He says, this was supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations, and you've made it into a den of, most translations say robbers. The Greek word liste means revolutionaries, zealots, revolution. He is not that kind of Messiah, and he's condemning the temple establishment for feeding that frenzy. And he's basically saying, I'm the Messiah, and because you are going to reject me, and you are going to go to the way of zealotry and revolution, Rome is going to come in, and he's going to level everything. Okay? And because he speaks against the temple and prophetically condemns it, that, along with his accusing the temple of establishment of being the bad guys, that's what gets him eventually killed. Okay? Historically speaking. The Passover meal, again, there's, when exactly it was, but obviously it was set in the context of a Passover meal, where the Passover meal celebrates the freeing of bondage of Egypt. Jesus obviously reinterprets the Passover meal and puts him at the center of it and says, what's about to happen over the next day, whenever you do this meal, think of this. He kind of reinterprets Passover around him. So basically, he's telling his followers, celebrate Passover and don't just think back to Egypt, where God freed you from the bondage of Egypt through the slaughtering of a lamb and the Passover. Look at what I'm going to do. I'm the Passover lamb. I'm going to shed my blood so that you can be freed, not from Egypt, not from Rome, but from sin and death and Satan himself. Basically, that's the significance of the Last Supper. We're told that Judas Iscariot obviously agrees to betray him. And here is another important thing to realize. If you've ever watched a movie or seen an Easter pageant of the arrest in Gethsemane, almost all the time people have Roman soldiers coming to arrest him. When you read the Gospels, that is not what happens. It's very clear that the temple authorities, the Jewish chief priests, the Sanhedrin, send their own police squad to Gethsemane, led by Judas, to arrest Jesus in the middle of the night, because they don't want to do it during the day, because they know the populace as a whole really like Jesus. Okay? So they had to do it in the middle of the night. Rome had nothing to do with actual arrest. It was the temple authorities who did it. And so what happens that night is when they arrest him in the middle of the night, they convene an illegal night trial of the Sanhedrin of some sort, and that's where they confront him over what he says about the temple and about being the Messiah. And as soon as he says, I'm the Messiah, you guys are the bad guys, and the temple will be destroyed, they know they want to get him killed. But the problem is the Sanhedrin doesn't have the authority to execute anybody, only Pilate does. And so what they do, they have this, it's basically a frame job, to be quite honest. They know they want him dead, but they know they want him dead, crucified up on that cross by daybreak, before the rest of Jerusalem finds out. Okay? So what they do at the break of day is they take Jesus to Pilate. They don't accuse Jesus of the things they accused him of during the nighttime trial, because in the nighttime trial, they were concerned with, oh, you spoke against the temple. What do you think Pilate's going to think about that? He's going to say, I don't care. It's your stupid temple. I'm a Roman governor. Oh, are you the Messiah? Pilate's not going to care if he's some religious figure. So what they do, when they take him before Pilate, they change their accusation from the temple Messiah language, and they tell Pilate, this guy claimed to be a king. That's political language, and Pilate knows as governor, what am I supposed to do with anyone who claims to be a king who's a threat to Caesar? Put him up on a cross really fast to send a message to anybody. Don't do that. And so that's what the Sanhedrin does. They accuse him before Pilate of claiming to be a king, which he does claim to be a king, but not the kind of political king that they're making it out. Pilate quickly sees that this is a trumped up charge that's completely bogus. And so when you read the gospel account, he knows Jesus isn't a threat and he wants to release him, partly because he just wants to tick off the Sanhedrin, because that's what he does. At this time, though, this is when the Sanhedrin says, if you do this, you're no friend of Caesar. That friend of Caesar was a very significant thing. That's basically saying, if you let Jesus go, we're going to send a message to Caesar and tell him that you let a threat to him go, and then you're going to be in trouble. And at that point, Pilate says, fine, crucify him. I interpret that as his thinking was probably, fine, he's just a worthless peasant. I don't care anyway. You got me now. Fine, whatever. But that is what happens. That is what leads to Jesus being on the cross. And so when he gets on the cross, that's why Caesar puts above his cross, King of the Jews. That is the official charge. He was crucified for being a zealot revolutionary. The irony is that he refused to be a zealot revolutionary. He refused to be the kind of Messiah that the Jews and the temple's, authorities were hoping. So they accuse him of being the kind of Messiah they wanted to get him killed. Does that make sense? Historically speaking, it's fascinating. All right, so that's a little bit about what happens at his trial. Obviously, there's more to it, but that's basically what I want you to see. Obviously, chapter 6 is more about the resurrection, and there is a huge, obviously, controversy about the claims of resurrection. Let's face it, it doesn't happen every day. And I think Witherington kind of goes over the controversy of what could have happened, what do they claim has happened, all that stuff. You've read it, you know. But here's a couple things just to keep in mind. When in Judaism, first century Judaism, resurrection meant physical resurrection, okay, especially among the Pharisees. And Paul was a Pharisee. And so when the claim of Jesus was resurrected, it was not a claim of, I know he died, but he's risen in my heart, in my spirit. Not that. And it's not, he died, but now he's in heaven. To say he was resurrected is a historical claim that they claim really happened. Now, whether or not you believe it or not, that's a whole other thing. And obviously, back then, that was a controversial claim anyway. But you have to be clear that the claim that Jesus was resurrected is a claim that he was bodily raised from the dead. And then he ascended to heaven after that. What that means, it's hard to get your mind around. But the resurrection claim is a claim that he was bodily resurrected. And this is why that's significant. The purpose and the point of the resurrection claim is not simply he came back from the dead and he's God. It's a little more complicated than that. The claim is every human dies, obviously. They go in the grave, we die. Death has power over us. The claim that Jesus rose from the dead is that he overcame death, physical death, that he was transformed to where he still has a physical body, but it won't see death anymore. And therefore, the Christian message that you see in the Gospels and in Paul and all this stuff is, if you put your faith in the resurrected one, you too, even though you're going to die, on the last day, at the turn of the ages, when all creation is made new, you will be physically resurrected, just like Jesus was physically resurrected on Easter Day. That's the good news that the Christians proclaimed, that because of Jesus, you can overcome death, basically. And obviously, that's a hard thing to get your mind around, but that's the claim. Okay? So, yeah. So anyway, obviously the rest of chapter 6 has a number of other things to talk about the historical questions. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. And then it gets into the very beginning of Acts and the Pentecost. Here's just the important thing to realize about Pentecost. Pentecost is kind of like considered the birth of the church. And at this point, at Pentecost, when that happens, the early Jesus movement, we'll just call it the Jesus movement at this point, was still an inner Jewish movement. Okay? And so what you see going on in the early chapters of Acts is something that happened within the Jewish community in Jerusalem. Okay? And so early on, if you read Acts, you kind of see that there were different sects of sects of Jews. You had Pharisees, Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots, but also this Jesus group. We're not going to call them Christians yet because that comes a little later in Antioch. But early on, it was just kind of known as the Way or the Nazarenes. But it was considered a movement within Judaism. And so what you read in the first chapters of Acts is that very thing. That initially, they had some confrontations with the Sanhedrin, but they were thought well of by their fellow Jews. But what really starts the division, the long, slow divorce that eventually becomes Christianity and Judaism, is the events in chapters 5 and 6 and 7, I think. Basically, it's this. The Jesus people in Jerusalem, led by the apostles, kind of had their own welfare thing going on, giving out meals to the poor. And apparently, the Greek-speaking Jews who had come in for Pentecost, who didn't speak Aramaic or Hebrew, they were kind of getting overlooked in the food distribution. Got a little discrimination going on because the Hebrews, Aramaic-speaking Jews, they're the real Jews. Those Greek-speaking Jews, they're a little tainted with the Greek-y stuff. So they were getting overlooked, and they take up their complaint to the apostles, and the apostles say, we're going to appoint 7 deacons to make sure that it gets distributed evenly. It's really important to note that the 7 guys they name are all Greek names. They're all Greek-speaking Jews. They're Hellenists to oversee the food distribution. That creates kind of a division among the Hebrew-speaking Jews and the Greek-speaking Jews. They don't like each other. And not only that, Stephen becomes very well known, and so he has a target on his back, and once he is brought before the Sanhedrin, he's accused of speaking against Moses and speaking against the temple. And when you look at what his speech is, it comes down to this. I'm not speaking against Moses. Look at your own history ever since the Exodus. You guys have always been rebelling against Moses. You guys have the problem with Moses, not me. As for the temple, and this is where he starts echoing what Jesus said, God doesn't want a temple made by human hands. He doesn't want it. It's going to get destroyed. And that gets him killed. Kind of like very similar with what got Jesus killed as well. And with that sparks the first persecution of the Jesus movement. And this is where they disperse out of Jerusalem and eventually go out throughout the world. And that's where we are now, and that's where you're doing now, chapters 7 and 8. Hopefully you enjoyed that. It was about a half hour. So there we go. Back next week with another video.